Okay, so what I'm going to be talking to you about today is the question of role to Codex. So this is a long, difficult, and unresolved question in the history of the late Roman Empire, this transition. It's generally agreed that we get from role to Codex somehow. I'm going to address that briefly, well, not so briefly, and in general, I'll let the title speak for itself. From role to Codex question, Christians, Manichaeans, and the book across late antique Eurasia. A bit of an outline for the talk. I'm going to first review a discussion, a scholarly discussion and debate that's been, I hesitate to say raging, but certainly produced some interesting exchanges over the past 100 years. So in this transition from the role to the Codex that we see in the late Roman Empire, why did it happen, and what role did the Christians, who seem to have displayed a unique preference for the Codex as opposed to other groups, what role did the Christians have in it? So this has produced a lot of interesting and rich historiographical questions, but many of them remain unresolved. And this is one of the impetuses of the seminar, is given this unresolved state, comparative examination of the kind of questions scholars have been asking here for other ancient cultures will be shed, I think, some well-needed light on this issue as well. And I think the kind of connection between early Christian book culture and the book culture of the ancient Eurasian mass more generally is Mani. So Mani is an arch heretic of the early church, and he's distinguished for more than any other Christian being really concerned with the history and importance of the book. He was active not in the Roman Empire, but in Mesopotamia, in the Iranian Empire. And there he had much greater connection to not so much China, but certainly to Indian culture and a number of other important book cultures. So looking at Mani's writing program and more generally what I've discussed in several publications, how Mani seems to be a sort of herald of a broader shift from oral to written scripture across late antique Eurasia. So Mani brings up a number of questions regarding cultural exchange in this period, and in particular the role of the manuscript within that. So it's within the context of Mani that I'll introduce some of the bigger questions of the seminar. And then finally, we're going to be looking at other areas of interest to the seminar, which broadly speaking fall under the heading of a kind of reflexive consideration of how do we understand ourselves as scholars and an interested public in the cultural and textual exchanges of these pre-modern manuscripts, which have a long life, which continues down to the present day. So what kind of things do we do to these manuscripts now? How does that relate to their history? And what are the consequences for their future? So things we're going to be looking at, I'll be touching briefly upon because they're of importance for the seminar, the series of manuscript workshops, which Tim Barrett will lead at the Center for the Book, new techniques in manuscript imaging, efforts to reconstruct ancient and medieval libraries digitally, and then finally our own contribution, which I hope will be a lasting one, which is collecting evidence on book history of pre-modern Eurasia for a database and a website. So we hope that this will be a sort of beyond the debate and discussion in our seminar, we will have that lasting online presence. So without further ado, I want to just get to the question of the literary role and the transition to the Codex and show you the sorts of debates that have arisen about what this process is. So this is a mosaic from Tunisia of Virgil, and you see Virgil here seated and holding a scroll. You may note that he's holding one end in his hand, and he's got it rolled over like this, So this is a standard technique of reading. We have other visual images. We wouldn't know that this is how it was read without these visual images, by the way. But in any case, Virgil here is quite comfortable holding presumably his own work. And the point that I want to get across here is that in the early Roman period, and certainly the early Roman imperial period and before that, in Greco-Roman culture, if you had a literary work, a finished literary work that you were reading privately or speaking out loud, it would be in the form of a roll, generally a papyrus roll. So that is how you presented finished literature in the Greco-Roman world. You read it on a roll. On the other hand, if you were just kind of taking notes from your teacher, if you were in a philosophy class, or if you were jotting down your own notes for what would later become a finished work of literature, you would take it generally on a wooden tablet. Often these tablets were treated with wax, so you can kind of inscribe and then erase. Sometimes they would be treated with parchment, but the kind of underlying distinction here is that these tablets were reserved for kind of the opening processes of textual composition. So you might take notes if you were the evangelist Mark and you were about to write a gospel. If you were doing it the traditional way, you might take notes on one of these, but then you would want to publish it later on as an actual scroll. Surprisingly, at least so far as we know from the historical record, by and large, that's not what the Christians did for a lot of their work. This is just to give you, I'm kind of heavy on the visual evidence here because I think in general it's sort of an undersourced way in which we can go about asking some key questions. In any case, this is from about the 5th century BCE. It's an Athenian red figure vase, and you can see almost like a tablet here. He's holding it with the stylus like an open laptop, I suppose, and it's in an instructional setting. So this kind of highlights the kind of provisional, ephemeral nature of writing on a codex. And this is a very famous picture from Pompeii of a woman, probably from the elite, holding in her hand a codex, a wooden codex, and she's got a stylus. And it's unclear, she might just be taking documentary accounts or she might be writing a book. But in any case, she's jotting down bits of information. Early Christians, at some point, began to use the book for finished literary products. So they kind of took what had originally just been a temporary measure in writing and began to use it to do any number of things. And we only have evidence for this process really beginning in the 3rd century. Here we have a 3rd century image from the catacombs of Peter and Marcellinus in Rome. We don't know who this character is. It's a Christian catacomb, but he's got a book open. We're not sure what the material is either, but this is probably the earliest depiction of a literary codex. Why do I think it's a literary codex? Well, simple reason is he's pointing to it, but he doesn't have a stylus or pen in hand. So it's like he's pointing to a literary work. This is a hotly debated thing, and it's open for debate, but that's how that's my sort of methodological gambit here. And also an interesting thing that happens at this time, so moving away from the early Christians for a minute, in the 1st century, we have the first Roman literary reference to a codex in Roman literature by the Roman epigrammist Martial, and he talks about the codex, but also he talks about parchment together. So he is suggesting, and it makes a lot of sense, that you might have parchment and codex go hand in hand, whereas before the most widespread material for the codex was wood and wax. So Marshall, by the way, this earliest reference, he seems to be talking about a finished piece of classical literature on a parchment codex. So the general question that I ask here, and we can ask in any number of cultural contexts, is does a new format like the Codex, what do we mean when we say manuscript innovation? Are we talking about the replacement of one sort of writing support for another? Or on the other hand, another interesting thing about this issue is parchment is, on the one hand, we can see how parchment would be a natural material for a codex as a kind of ephemeral writing support because it's much easier to erase. So we can imagine that parchment and the codex, as their popularity grows, parchment would have been the natural material for it. But on the other hand, if we look at our evidence, it's actually papyrus that we have the majority of the earliest texts and codices in. So basically what I'm trying to get at here is just simply questioning the relationship between format and material. Was parchment the natural pair for the early codex, or was the reason that the codex was actually successful because, okay, it may have arisen with parchment, but then it was easily transferable to papyrus? So a number of open questions there. So the Christians, it seems, going back to that painting from the catacombs of Marcellinus, so maybe he was holding a parchment codex, maybe he was holding a papyrus codex. Ultimately, that's a silly question. But in any case, what we do get as a complement to the visual evidence, which begins in the 3rd century, a number of papyri manuscripts from the 3rd century, which are in codex form. And these papyri manuscripts are of finished pieces of literature. So this is written in a literary hand. This is the most famous one by far, Chester Beatty Biblical Papyrus 1, also called P45. This caused quite a sensation in 1930 when it was first published. So previously, it kicked forward the earliest date of a complete New Testament codex about 100 years. So this is a full papyrus codex of the Gospels and Acts. And we see that Christians were bucking the trend in using codices rather than scrolls for their literature. And the editor of this P45, Kenyon, in 1933, used the somewhat unfortunate terminology, the Christian addiction to the Codex. And this was actually, so it was a major public event in the 30s when he published this thing, and his terminology, and it led to a bunch of, it began the trend of what I think has been a heated debate, but a productive one, about why this is. So the one thing that pretty much everybody agrees on is simply that Christians, as opposed to non-Christians, had I wouldn't call it an addiction, but they had a noted preference for using the Codex for finished literature. So if we look at, this is from the Leuven Database of Ancient Books, I'm taking it from Larry Hurtado's 2006 publication. If we look at all surviving manuscripts from literary manuscripts from the ancient world in the 2nd century, 4.9% of those are codices. However, if we look at all surviving Christian books from the literary manuscripts from the 2nd century, 71% of them are codices. In the 3rd century, we see that the number of codices overall increases, and the number of codices among the Christians is 67%. So it stays about the same, but in both cases, there is a noted preference for the Codex among the Christians. So this is what everybody agrees on, and this is what has been debated now for about the last 80 or so years. So I'm just going to run through with you some of the interesting proposals that have come forward for why Christians use the Codex as opposed to the scroll. So an interesting one, actually, by a famous rabbinic scholar, Saul Lieberman, who wrote this book, Greek and Jewish Palestine. He argued that Jesus needs to be understood in his Jewish context, and that in the Jewish context, at least as far as the rabbinic sources are concerned, there's a prohibition against using the roll format for anything but sacred scripture. If the rabbis were debating and you wanted to take notes about what your rabbinic teacher told you, you could do that, but you wrote it on a codex form. So insofar as Jesus was a rabbi and his followers were taking notes on his teaching, they would have used the codex form. And then as the Gospels grew out of notes on Q, I won't run you through all of the interesting biblical studies proposals, but Q is, in traditional biblical studies, there's an idea that the gospel authors used a collection of Jesus's teachings. So the idea was that if they are simply taking notes of Jesus's teachings, they, in order to be in line with Jewish or at least rabbinic sensibilities, when they composed the Gospels out of these sources, they continued to use the Codex, so as not to imply that the Gospels were in some way scriptural on the same level as the Jewish scriptures. So that is interesting, and I think, like many of these, I think it gets some things right. However, for me, a glaring issue is that, to my knowledge, the authors don't address at all, at least Lieberman was writing before the Gospel of Thomas. But an interesting thing about Christian usage is, so 71% about that are codices, but the Christians were also using rolls, and one of the type of document that the Christians were putting on rolls was apocryphal literature like the Gospel of Thomas. So why would, if they were using the Codex for something like Mark to avoid offending Jewish sensibilities, then why would they put the Gospel of Thomas, which makes equal claims to authority as Mark, on a roll? So it doesn't, there are holes in this argument that I think need to be resolved. Others have argued that there was an institutional impetus for doing this. So this is Roberts and Skeet, who wrote an influential volume in 1983, The Birth of the Codex. They said that these are both very talented scholars, and this is an interesting hypothesis, but it's very flimsy. I mean, it's based really on absolutely no evidence at all. So they said that the gospel, Mark wrote his gospel on a parchment codex in Rome, and they quoted Marshall, who we just discussed. And this was the first gospel. And then, according to tradition, Mark goes to Alexandria and founds the church in Egypt. So they hypothesized that Mark got to Egypt to use papyrus because it was cheaper there, so he adopted the form of, he adopted papyrus as a material for the Codex. And then the Alexandrian church, which was very powerful because they were supporting it, they gave their institutional support to the Codex. In general, Christians adopted it. So again, I mean, without sounding disrespectful, there's not a shred of evidence to support this theory. On the other hand, it does raise the question of institutional support. And I think that is an important idea, that we have to look for institutions as drivers of this process. So others have argued that Christians might have been interested in the Codex for various reasons, which had to do with their identity, but were also practical. So many codices were small; you could fit it in your backpack as opposed to the big roll. So if Paul was going around trying to convince people that they should follow the Jewish scriptures, which were fulfilled in Jesus, it was easier for him to take excerpts of the Jewish scriptures in a codex. You can take excerpts of the Jewish scriptures in a codex. And also, it was easier for him because in Acts of the Apostles, it refers to Paul debating in synagogues. It was easier for him to use that to refer to in debate. So the Codex. And this, again, is an interesting hypothesis, but there's not a lot of information or evidence to back it up. Another interesting thought, which I think has got some plausibility to it, is that one of the general advantages of the Codex overall is that you can fit more text on it. And in particular, the Christians were able to, at an early date, in the 2nd century anyway, they were collecting 7 Pauline epistles and 4 Gospels together, and they were able to do this in a single codex. So the kind of physical possibilities of the manuscript format aligned with their theological intent. And then eventually, when we get to the 4th century, the New Testament is the large deluxe codices that we get from the era of Constantine fit the entire New Testament. Of course, they fit more than that. And I also think that another issue with this is I don't see how this could drive, I mean, it's a possible, it's definitely a possible aspect of why Christians adopted it, but I don't think it's a single solution to the problem. So anyway, a broader issue is Christians were kind of forerunners of adopting the Codex. They had this marked preference, and eventually the whole Roman Empire shifted broadly to the Codex. There's a question, did Christians popularize it? And that has always been in the background. Many people for a long time thought that they did, and they kind of tied the so-called triumph of Christianity in the Roman Empire to the triumph of the Codex. But as recent studies, for instance, by the papyrologist Roger Bagnall, have reminded us, in fact, the majority of the earliest literary codices were actually not Christian, despite the Christian preference for them. So we can't therefore say that the Christians themselves are responsible for the general spread of the Codex in the Roman Empire. So if we're thinking about why the Codex spread in the Roman Empire broadly, not just among Christians, but among everybody else, we might look to other aspects. So one issue, one potential idea here could be an economic motivation. So codices in general are more cost-effective than rolls for the very simple reason. This has been a general argument, which I think needs to be complicated. I think in general, we can say that the format of the Codex is cost-effective because you can write more in a Codex than you can in a roll. For instance, in particular, you can write on both sides of a Codex, whereas in a roll you can only write on one side. However, that format isn't the only economic factor in producing a manuscript. So in general, we need to look at the relative cost of papyrus versus parchment in whatever format you decide. and these must have varied widely throughout the empire. So we can't really say that economics, or at least we don't know enough to say that economic factors were the sole driving force. Practical motivations, so in media studies theory, codices have been, the emphasis has been, well, with the Codex, you can open it, you can put page numbers on it, you can keep track of where important parts are, bookmarking more easily with page numbers, even though they didn't do things like create index. So it's kind of like advanced information technology. And that's true, I think, but I would only point out here that that isn't actually ever pointed to in ancient sources. That's an interesting thing. So it's kind of one of the hallmarks is comparative media studies and information studies has pointed this out, but we don't hear the ancient authors talking about it. So, and then the other big practical motivation, which we've talked about in the context of the Christians, is that on a codex you can fit more into it than you can in a papyrus roll. Another thing that I would like to point out is that codices, of course, we don't know technologically they developed over time. So, for example, the earliest codices can't fit a lot of, comparatively, fit much less text than the later ones. Our 3rd century codex fit only the 4 Gospels. By the 4th century, I'm going to show you Codex Sinaiticus later on, which fit many more different books. So, we have technological development, but we don't know much about it. And we can't say, if we're going to analyze it economically, we don't know what the motivations are and who's driving it. I could only speculate that perhaps in the case of the much larger 4th century codices, Eusebius tells us that the Emperor Constantine requested a number of them. So it may have been, the drive to developing bigger codices may have been demand-driven, but we can only really speculate. So another question that I would like to ask to kind of almost turn the issue of the development of the Codex on its head, the spread of the Codex on its head, for a long time in Antiquity, we have codices and rolls together. So a mix of these different formats. And indeed, all the way through the 7th or the 8th century, that continues to be the case. So Christians didn't only use the Codex, they continued to use the roll. But the question is always framed in the sense of the rise of the Codex. Why did it gain popularity? But why can't we also ask, why did the roll format, granted that it was losing ground to the Codex, why did it eventually just completely disappear, effectively, almost from the Mediterranean world? And it does this in the sort of post-Islamic Mediterranean in the 8th and the 9th century. So this is just a general kind of strategy that I'd like to do in the seminar is try to reframe questions, and this also takes us out of the narrative of Christian triumphalism and injects sort of a different temporal perspective. Another thing that I think isn't discussed enough in the question of the Codex is the role of the state in the Codex, especially the late Roman state, where we have, and we see it especially in the collection of the Theodosian Code, a preference for using the Codex to record laws, at least archivally. So this is from a diptych of Provianus, who is a late Roman consul. He's not the emperor himself, but he's here, he's got his arm raised, which showing he's dictating a decree of some force, and his assistants are writing it down. Now, so far, this could have been a scene from the early Roman Empire where codices were used to transcribe oral teaching or directives. But when we look at the publication of the Theodosian Code, the kind of canonical form of the code were large codices, which were deposited in Rome and Constantinople and kept there as authoritative copies. So I think the Roman emperor and the role of Roman law may also have a place in this discussion, although I haven't researched this in any detail. And I also add the general question, in the spirit of reframing questions, what is the role of Islam in this broader process, and why did when you consider all of the ink that's been spilled on why Christians chose the Codex, almost nothing has been written. I hesitate to say nothing. It's become Francois de Roche and other experts in early Islam will be coming here. But in general, until the past 10 years or so, very little has been written on why the early Islamic movement chose the Codex for the Quran as opposed to the roll format, especially when we consider all the work that's been done on early Islamic connections between both Judaism and Christianity. Why did the early Muslim elite choose the Codex as opposed to the roll for their sacred scripture? And this is clearly a very early choice and a very important one for the fate of the book in the medieval Mediterranean more broadly. So this is a codex that's been radiocarbon dated to the mid-7th century from Sana'a, the Mosque of Sana'a in Yemen. And I point here to the story of the standardization or the canonization of the Quran, which has one of the early caliphs, Uthman. He notices that there are different textual variations and also differences in recitation. So he wants to standardize it. He creates a commission for figuring out the standard text, kind of like the commission for gathering the Theodosian Code. And then once the standard text has been decided, he keeps a copy in Damascus and sends it out to Medina and all of the other provincial capitals. So this sounds a lot like the story of Theodosius and the promulgation of the Code. However, I would also note, this is sort of an ongoing area of interest for me, there's also in rabbinic literature a story about how the Torah, under the Second Temple, a standard copy of the Torah was kept in the temple as a reference, a lot like the imperial code and then the Quran. So this isn't to say that Uthman was following a Theodosian model as opposed to a Jewish model, but it's to show that there are a lot of complicated things going on here and interconnections between various religious groups which are closely caught up in the choice of manuscript format. So another thing that is true in general is that scholars of early Christianity have raised the issue of the Codex in terms of triumphalism. So the idea that the Codex, just like Christianity, becomes the religion of the Roman Empire, there's an idea that the Codex kind of triumphs with Christianity. And this isn't really fair to the Christian evidence. So if you look at individual groups of late antique Christians, like in the next couple of slides, I'm going to be running you through the evidence from a 5th and 6th century Egyptian monastery, the monastery of the red and white monastery in Sohag, Upper Egypt. If we do these kind of micro histories of Christian communities, we'll see that the Codex was used, and it was an important part of their kind of textual culture, but it was used very closely alongside the roll. So the Christians didn't see the Codex as sort of the exclusive textual agent, and we need to think more about how different groups at particular points in time were using various manuscript cultures. The Codex and the roll, as I argue in this work From Textual to Ritual Practice, they each had their own proper place in monastic textual culture. The roll was something that monastic leaders used to write letters to their communities, but in the case of Shenouda, who actually tries to get his letters copied and transmitted in codices, I argue in this article that the shift from the papyrus roll to the codex in Shenouda's monastery occurs when Shenouda has his writings that he originally wrote on papyrus. He declares that they will be read out every year, 4 times a year, in a communal ritual. So once Shenouda is sort of canonizing his writings, then he has them transferred from papyrus roll to codex. But in any case, not only the papyrus roll and the codex, but also things like tablets, other types of inscriptions, wall painting, they all have a rich role to play in early monastic textual culture. So the one kind of in early monastic textual culture, the Codex did have a central role as the sort of format of choice by evangelists. So this is a painting from the Red Monastery Church. Betsy Bowman, this is from a project where I was involved as the epigraphist, the inscription guide. Art historian Betsy Bowman, she's got a volume that was just published with all of these wonderfully restored paintings. And the paintings and visual evidence more generally helps us kind of get a broader understanding of how these communities use textual formats. So the evangelist Mark here has got a codex, and the codex was especially, it seems, in these communities associated with the evangelists. And that actually kind of goes with this doesn't prove Roberts and Skeet's crazy idea about Mark the evangelist bringing the codex to Egypt and causing this popularity, but it does show that late antique Christians thought the evangelists anyway were using codices. However, if you look at just direct your gaze a little bit to the left in the same set of paintings, this is the prophet Jeremiah here holding out a roll. And in general, in these monastic paintings, the idea is that prophets had rolls and evangelists had codices. So is this historical memory? Is this kind of a confirmation somehow of that Christians were aware that the codex was different from the roll? Maybe. I mean, they certainly associated the roll with prophets, but also with letters. So Paul was seen primarily as a letter writer, and that's Paul right there, the Apostle Paul, and there he's got a collection of letters in the form of papyrus rolls in his hand. So in the monastic mind anyway, only evangelists had codices. Paul wrote on letters, even if they had manuscripts of Paul's letters in codex form, and the prophets wrote on rolls. This is a picture of Paul as philosopher from about the same period in a 4th century catacomb. So Christians through late antiquity, they didn't see the codex as triumphing, In this picture, they are presenting Paul as a philosopher, partially on the strength of the traditional image of the philosopher as a transmitter of teachings through the Codex. And he's got this is called a capsa, his collection of papyrus rolls. And then a little down the road in Rome in the catacombs of Domitilla, here we see a matron and her kind of patron saint here depicted on a wall. And we see here too that she's a reader of Christian books, and she uses, although there is this fascinating image of kind of a codex taking air with a snake, there's also a collection of papyrus books. So this is all just to suggest that the codex did not actually triumph, it just had a place in the late antique Christian imagination. And to get back to the monastery here, this is a silver cross from the 6th century from the White Monastery, so the same community where with the paintings that I showed you. And it was created by Ama Manu, the Archimandrite. Shenouda's monastery had 3 different communities, including a women's community. So she is depicted right there, and in her hand, she is holding a roll. So in the 6th century, kind of monastic authority could still be presented in terms of wielding this particular textual artifact. So it's not as if the role was no longer significant for these groups. And in fact, as I said, the role had a sort of prophetic connotation, and monastic leaders were supposed to be like prophets. They were supposed to announce the sin of the community and get them to repent. So a couple of final reflections on this first part of the talk, and I see I'm going to have to speed up a bit for the second part. But looking at the type of evidence that scholars have used, we see a combination of textual, visual, and material culture evidence. So the Codex is based, the evidence for the rise, so-called, of the Codex is based largely on material culture. You know, we have surviving manuscripts, and we can kind of count them and compare them. Most of this is papyrus. Most of it is preserved only in Egypt. In early Christian texts, they often talk about books, but they use terms that are actually ambiguous. So we don't actually, for many terms like librum, we don't know whether that's a roll or a codex. And there are no questions or no discussions that really ask what scholars over the past 100 years have cared about. So, you know, there is no real interest in the relative merits of the Codex and the manuscripts. There's no actual passage where it says, oh, I like the Codex because it helps me on my missionary activity, or I can refer to it more easily. So there's a real disconnect between the ancient sources and the scholarly discussion. And then visual evidence, of which we hope to get a lot for our website and this seminar, is underutilized. We could do a lot more with it, but it's also difficult to interpret. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the second part of the lecture, which is looking at Mani. So Mani is a 3rd century Christian. This is his seal. It may actually be the seal used by the real Mani. And it says Mani, Apostle of Jesus Christ. So he's got a fascinating and varied teaching, which I will only say is basically Christian, but he has a strong dualistic sense. So he posited a king of darkness at the beginning and a king of light, and the world was created when darkness attacked the light, and the light kind of rose to defend itself. The material world was created, and eventually the two will be separated and darkness is destroyed. So this is an image of Manichaeism spread way east into China. This is a fascinating painted silk scroll that was only recently discovered in Japan. And here we have Mani teaching depicted as Buddha, but the teachings that he describes of punishment of bad souls and the judgment of the soul and the punishment of the bad soul and the apotheosis of the good soul, these are very Christian themes. So most scholars today would argue that Mani is basically Christian, even though he also claimed that he was the successor of Zoroaster and Buddha. So Mani, more than any other Christian, emphasized the importance of writing. So this is from the Kephaliah. He says, it's fragmentary, unfortunately. My church surpasses in the wisdom and which I have unveiled for you in it, the immeasurable wisdom I have written in the holy books, in the great gospel. So he wrote his own gospel, and the other writings, so that it will not be changed after me. So he also wrote a picture book, which Gulacsi will talk to us about later. But the idea is, he says that he's unique of all religious founders, as opposed to, so he wrote a living gospel. This is the living gospel. It's not preserved in the West because his writings were burned, but traces of his writings have been discovered in the Turfan Oasis on the Silk Road. He was active in Babylon, which was part of the Iranian Empire, and his writings were probably in Aramaic, but quickly translated into Persian. So a Persian translation of his gospel has been discovered in Turfan. It's fragmentary. We also have fragments of illuminated Manichaean manuscripts from Turfan, and these are scribes here. You see the great importance of scribal culture for the Manichaean worldview. So Mani was really into writing. He used writing to distinguish himself. He said, in a sense, I'm fulfilling earlier apostles of light, like Jesus, Zoroaster, and Buddha. He saw himself as their perfecters, but he says that he's better than them, and he's better than the churches that they founded, because he wrote down his teachings himself. He says that Zoroaster didn't write down his own teachings, Jesus didn't write down his own teachings, Buddha didn't write down his own teachings, their followers did, and they made a mess of it. So their followers got things wrong, it was corrupted, and so basically the Manichaean church is superior to all the others because they have the revelation straight from Mani's hand, and the Zoroastrians, Christians, and Buddhists just have a corrupted scripture. So this is just to give you a sense of the geographic scope. This is how I want to kind of expand the question of role to Codex across Eurasia. So Mani is Christian and connected to Christian communities, but he's active in Babylon, which is part of the Sasanian Empire in the mid-3rd century. So his followers expand to the east, including during his lifetime, and to the west, and then ultimately to the Silk Road, where the kingdom of Kocho, the Uyghur Turkish kingdom, and then to China. So they were very broadly spread out, and everywhere they went, they took this great love of the book and book culture with them. And so in an earlier article, I noted called Religious Intercrossing, which looked at loss, corruption, and transcription of oral to written scripture. I noticed that Mani's passages, which I just shared with you, this polemical claim that his predecessors didn't write down their teachings, this corresponded with a number of internal discussions in a lot of different places in kind of long late antiquity. So from the 2nd to the 6th century approximately, where oral teachings were written down for the first time. So we see this in Judaism with the Mishnah and the Talmud, Christianity and Jesus traditions, Zoroastrianism with the Avesta, or at least the Zsuzsanna's translation, the formations of Buddhist canons in Gandhara, the debate about the Confucian, the reliability of Confucian writings with the transmission of paper and the discovery of older writings in the Han Dynasty. So that's less oral to written, but a concern for corruption. And so I saw in all of these this pattern, and I didn't argue per se that this all has to do, Mani spread this anxiety, but simply that Mani's polemical complaint reflects this anxiety, and also this broader process of writing down these religious groups using writing for the first time, at least for certain things. So in a sense, what I noticed then was that there is no good history of the book, which looks at all of these regions. For a lot of these regions, we know some things, but in others, like for the Iranian region, there's been very little work done on what exactly the early Sasanian book looked like. So it's a real paradox that we have Mani, who is the apotheosis of Christian love of the book. He's writing in 3rd century Sasanian Empire in Iran, and we don't know whether he used the Codex or the scroll. So, because we know nothing about Sasanian book culture. That's an exaggeration. My colleague Shai will talk to us next Friday about Zoroastrian and rabbinic book culture. But I think it's funny, in a sense, in a scholarly way, that, given all of the ink spilled on the transition from roll to Codex in the West, the real representative of Christian book culture, Mani, who focused on the importance of written traditions, we don't really know anything about the manuscripts he wrote on. We have later manuscripts by his followers, but because we don't know anything about Zoroastrianism. So this is when I started thinking, wouldn't it be great if we did a global history of manuscript cultures and looking at questions of religious transmitters like Mani and the sort of dynamics that were going on there. So to show you a couple of the regions and things that were going on. So I mentioned Mani was active in Mesopotamia, part of the Iranian Empire. In that region before Mani, we had what to me may be the only total disappearance of a, maybe I'm wrong here, but one of the few total disappearances of a writing format. So in Mesopotamia, we had clay tablets for millennia, which just about at the time of Mani in the 2nd century CE, completely disappeared. So this is one of the few examples where a manuscript format is completely dropped. Not even the roll in the medieval West is completely dropped. There's a kind of memory of it, but in its place was importation, if you will. This is a Elephantine, one of the Elephantine Aramaic scrolls. So by the time of Mani, they spoke Aramaic and Zoroastrian, Aramaic and Iranian in the Sasanian Empire, and they used rolls by and large. But Mani may have used the Codex because he was a Christian. But we don't know. This is actually from the 5th century. And we don't have any material remains from the Sasanian period. What we do have is, and this is kind of an interesting side note, the Mandaeans, who are probably, go back to the period of Mani. This is a Mandaean baptism in the Charles River. They're a group that, like Manichaeans, have kind of idea of a kingdom of light and a kingdom of darkness. and they have, they're a persecuted minority group in Iraq and Iran, and have a diaspora across the world. They have what is probably a continuous tradition of roles. So this is one of the, and it's been overlooked, but this would suggest that when Mani was, if their tradition of roll production goes back to the Sasanian period, this would suggest that Mani, when he was writing, might have used a roll himself. But he may have used a codex because what I showed you earlier, the gospel, Mani's living gospel, as it's preserved in the Silk Road, is actually in codex format. So anyway, it's a big hole in our knowledge, and I look forward to Shai's lecture to kind of clear things up. In northwest India, in Gandhara, we have originally, around the time of Mani, the Buddhist canon, or a form of it, gets written down on birch bark rolls. Later it switches to Pathi manuscripts. Richard Salomon will talk to us about that. In China, about this time, or during the Han Dynasty, there's a general transition from bamboo manuscripts to paper manuscripts. So these are the sorts of phenomenon that are happening around the period of Mani that I was curious to look at, and that we will discuss over the course of the seminar. And the other thing that I argued in the Mani article is that if Mani reflects this general anxiety that we need to take our oral scripture and we need to write it down, part of the reason that he does that is that he and his followers are traveling from court to court all across Eurasia. So the Silk Road wasn't just about commercial exchange, it was also about political, traveling itinerant wise men and religious leaders that went across these local courts seeking patronage. And one of the ways, at least Mani asserted his authority and prestige in this kind of competition for patronage was his skill in the book arts. And at the same time, there's various evidence that I noted in the article that rulers in these local courts were supporting scribal elites, and they were doing things like encouraging the development of new scripts and probably also new manuscript formats. So this was kind of a clue that I hit upon that I hope we will discuss in more detail in the seminar. And this is one of the many images of the Silk Road, but it gives you a brief sense of the kind of networks and major court areas where the Manichaeans and others were active. And this is to give you a sense of some of the questions that I asked presenters. So the range of manuscript formats, materials, and scripts used in the regions by the cultures you're presenting on. Describe the material evidence and associated linguistic terminology. So I also want them to talk to us about the written evidence. The earliest evidence for the appearance of new manuscript formats, materials, and scripts. What is the evidence for the spread of these formats, particular times and places in which they're popular? Is there a decline, complete disappearance? Are there identifiable factors that lead to diffusion? Are these economic, practical, or religious? Can we identify a particular group or institution, such as a monastery or imperial bureaucracy, in which significant manuscript innovations developed, or identify major social, cultural, and historical factors? How does choosing a specific manuscript format, material, or script relate to the social, cultural, and or religious context of the producer and user? And how did the development of new manuscript formats relate to broader aspects of society and culture, such as practices of writing, authorship, manuscript distribution, reading, recitation, and the oral written interface? So all of these questions are going to be addressed in this wonderful lineup that you've seen. And I look forward to hearing about that. Another aspect of the seminar, forgive me if I'm moving a little fast here because I see we're already at 2:10. We're going to be doing, the seminar participants are going to be working to construct some of these new formats. And once we have actual physical specimens of them, we can do a kind of experimental practice to ask ourselves various kinds of questions about how they might have been used that the written sources don't tell us. And as far as I know, I've only in all of my reading found one example of somebody who's done this sort of, constructing an actual format and then using it to answer questions. So Jocelyn Small, in her book, was trying to figure out, whether it was possible to write columns, so use a papyrus roll without a table that is for note-taking, as opposed to a codex. And her answer was, yes, it is actually possible. So that would suggest that, the codex, the roll could have also been used for the primary functions of the codex. Of course, the danger in this is that manuscript practices and skills are cultural specific and learned, so we can reproduce the object itself, but we can't reproduce the sort of training and habitus, manuscript habitus of an ancient user. But nonetheless, I hope that we are able to do various kind of physical calisthenic experiments with these manuscripts, like when we make papyrus rolls, to get back to biblical studies questions. So there's a running debate on the synoptic problem. Could Mark have had Hugh and Luke, could Luke have had Hugh and Mark open at the same time and coordinated it? How easy is it? There's a famous passage in Luke when Jesus opens a roll in the middle of the synagogue, and there's a question as actually it's been famously argued recently that it couldn't have been a roll. It had to have been a book, because how could he have held his place there? So how do you hold your place with a papyrus roll, or reference other? Maybe it is actually against the media theorists. Maybe it is just as easy to track down, bookmark a papyrus roll as it is a codex. Nobody's actually tried. And then we can also do fun things like on December 2nd, we'll have people reconstructing both papyrus rolls and Silk Road model paper rolls. So we can see if the material format has advantages. So, is it easier to make a large papyrus roll than it is paper roll than it is a papyrus roll? So we can ask new questions with this kind of practice. This is a picture of Jesus holding a roll, and we'll be doing all sorts of exercises with seeing how we interact with these physical specimens when we recreate them. And then more generally, this is what I call, this is me working with my colleagues Jason and Ian on the Dublin Kephaliah Codex, so another source of the author Mani. And I note here that this is sort of multi-aval media. So we are looking at the ancient papyrus here under glass, and in the background are print books, and you see me on the computer. I'm not even looking at I traveled to Dublin to look at the papyrus, and I'm staring at the computer screen because there are enhanced images there. So the kind of work that scholars do now is part of the kind of life history of these manuscripts. So we are going to also, as part of the seminar, think about the idea of textual and cultural exchanges as something we and also the public are doing now to the same manuscripts. So we have Vito Mocella and Brent Seals are going to talk to us about imaging practices. There are a lot of new ways to read faded or hidden text. Many of these are dependent on the sort of material of the written support and the chemical composition of the ink. So trying to figure out what cultures share what kind of material and ink structure that could have consequences for these imaging possibilities. Other people are reuniting manuscripts online. This is the Codex Sinaiticus. I showed you P45, which was a codex of just the 4 Gospels and Acts from the 3rd century. By the 4th century, they figured out how to make a deluxe codex with all of the New Testament and a number of other non-canonical works. In the 19th century, it was taken from, stolen from the monastery of St. Catherine's at Sinai, dispersed across European collections, and now is being reunited digitally online. And this is the case, the White Monastery, where I showed you images from before. Similar things happened in the 19th century, where books were ripped up, sold to scholars. They've been totally dismembered all across libraries all across the world, and are being steadily reunited online. So Sabine Schmidtke will talk to us about how to, how we might reunite a library of Yemenite and Iranian Arabic manuscripts digitally. So these sorts of practices will be of interest to us. And then finally, a major goal of the seminar is to produce a website where we can kind of visualize the process of cultural transmission, or at the very least, the spread of manuscript formats, materials, and scripts across pre-modern Eurasia. So we're going to create a database with a primarily map-based interface where for any given manuscript format or material, people will be able to see where it appears first on the timeline and look at relevant English translations of relevant writings that talk about it, ancient or medieval writings, and also any images that we have as long as they follow copyright. So one of the things that we're doing in addition to their presentation is that we're asking presenters to bring relevant bibliography, translations, and images that we can post online. So I'll wrap up with that because this is a major kind of thing that we're building in the project. And we hope that at the end of it, we will be able to, I mean, it's going to be a sort of design issue as well. How will people interact with such a huge map, and how will they tally or go back and forth between image and text? But we'll do it, we'll figure it out, and we'll get all of that material there. And we're hoping that this will be of interest, very broadly, high school, college, and to the interested public. So with that, I will say thank you for your continued attention over more than an hour, and I look forward to this wonderful seminar, and I hope that you all come to give the presentation. Thank you. So there's 10 minutes for Q&A. Fred.
Yeah, I've been wondering about the material too, because as far as I know, the codices were originally made with animal skins and the scrolls from papyrus. So, but it looks like by the time of the Sinaiticus, didn't look like animal skin to me. But
no, Sinaiticus is papyrus, yeah.
So did the whole format of the way they made codices change at a certain point to make it easier to carry around and easier to distribute?
Well, we have, so the very first codices are smaller. They tend to be smaller. They're all, the material evidence for the earliest codices is all papyrus pretty much. But that's because they're preserved primarily in Egypt. So the Marshall, the first literary reference to a codex, says that it was written on parchment. In their early life, somewhere in the transition from codex as something we write notes on to codex as something that we carry a finished literary product on, papyrus became another possible material. but you know, it's possible that in Rome, for the Christians there, parchment is always what they use. Sorry.
Yeah. So
Sure.
Paul is supposed to have been a tent maker, a skinoploid,
Right.
if we believe ash, etc.
Yes.
So he worked with animal skins a lot.
Indeed.
So
Yes.
he made tents out of leather, and so
Yes.
it's not that hard to think that he would also be able to make parchment
Sure.
himself, right?
Yeah.
And the other things, like I've done a lot of work with the food supply in the 3rd and 4th century, and you've seen the bioarchaeological evidence that they're eating more protein. There's that the pork enters into the animal rations, and there's an increase in eating cattle.
Okay.
And that just means that there's more meat in diets, but that also means that there are more skins that are in circulation.
Yeah.
Right? So that might be part of it. But the real question I was thinking about is like the Tabula Tunicariana, which is we believe Richard Calvert is the late 3rd century, which I do in my advisors.
Sure.
You know, his late 3rd century we think was parchment. And his hypothesis about the tabula is that you carry it around with you and put it in the throne room as you travel around. As the emperor travels around, he carries the tabula with him.
Right.
And it's wrapped up as parchment and carries. And so I kind of like this travel narrative a lot. This idea that parchment just travels better, particularly for missionaries and evangelists going around. And that's one reason that the Codex is made out of parchment, because A, the Codex is easier to carry on, and B, also the parchment wears better. Like when you're constantly using it and touching it all the time, parchment is just much better for wear and tear than papyrus is.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point, and changing the terms of the conversation a bit, because generally I showed that argument by F that Christians, you know, use the Codex because it was good to travel with, but he said it was good to travel with because of its small format. But you're saying that it was good to travel with because parchment was good to travel with.
Parchment feels much more easily than papyrus. Papyrus, you can, like, you know, you can feel a papyrus and make it a little, you can put kind of a gloss over top of it, but we don't get a lot of evidence that that existed, like a liqueur or lacquer, sorry. Two different things. Over top of it to make it less brittle. But the roll is what preserves the papyrus more than the parchment. I mean, for parchment, it's
although we do have
brittle.
parchment rolls.
We
So,
do. I mean, the
yeah.
tabula is rolled up as a
Right.
parchment roll. And syllaboid that we have, the little tags that come out of the top, they're usually made out of parchment as well. But still, I kind of think that parchment, and maybe we'll just have to keep doing it, is much more travel friendly.
Well, in Pauline circles, they do use parchment. I think in 1 Timothy, he talks about bringing along the membranas. So, I mean, there is, I think that's definitely good evidence for that.
I was actually just going to bring that up in 2 Timothy 4:13. Bring me the books, especially membranas, especially the parchment.
Okay, yeah, so good. There's a promising, I mean, the only, and this gets back to the whole format material dialectic. If parchment is the real key for travel, then, you know, why weren't they using parchment rolls as opposed to parchment codices? And maybe then we get back to the idea that the roll tended Jewish scriptural or rabbinic scriptural sensibilities. So, yeah, thank you. Lots of complex issues. Yeah.
I would just like to throw out something against the material view of the Codex being preferred because it's easier to find references to bookmark and so forth, because you can cite particular page numbers and so forth. Page numbers don't appear before the 12th century, so people are not using it for that purpose.
Yeah, you don't get. It's true that you don't get a lot of page numbers in early manuscripts, and even if you did have a page number, I mean, you didn't have a single publisher. So, you know, it's not like if Paul was debating in the synagogues, and this is F's argument, he could say, "Oh, well, refer to page 5 of Isaiah." I mean, you know, it doesn't work.
Well, just quickly on that, I mean, but it is easier to go back and forth, right? So you can more easily, like, go back and say, "Hey, I read something a while ago, and I want to look at it again." But anyway, my question is
Yes.
really, my question is really that the sort of overall development you described of first rolls, then rolls and codices, and then only codices, right?
Yes.
So we've seen that mirrored in China.
Okay.
Right? I mean, more or less the same thing. You only have scrolls. I'm not sure if there's a technical distinction. I don't know much. But we always talk about scrolls in China. But anyway, they're, rolled up. And then you see, like, both. But eventually, you only really see these sort of volumes, typically are stitched. So I just wonder, did anyone write about this? Do you know about did anyone write about this process in China? I wonder if there's sort of insights that could be.
Oh, about the process of stitching together.
Yeah, right. I mean, just the process of going from scroll to codex. If somebody wrote about this in the Chinese example, it might sort of illuminate your.
Yeah, no, I would love. I mean, that's precisely the type of comparanda I'm looking for. I'm not aware of it, but that is our big event, December 2nd. Where we'll have both scholars and conservators from Miriam Crutch and Bill Johnson taking care of the papyrus role, and then Susan Whitfield and Mark Barnard taking care of the paper scroll. So we'll have hopefully a really good discussion of comparison then. And I have my fingers crossed that there are Chinese sources which explicitly deal with these issues.
I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I sort of doubt it, but.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you can really talk about the liturgical dimension of this. It seems like, it's the case that Jewish authoritative readings in the synagogue were somehow done with Codex, or were they always done?
Yeah, never. At least according to, we're beholden to the rabbinic evidence, so we can't say that all Judaism necessarily followed the rabbinic writings, but the rabbinic writings state that, for synagogue recitation, it has to be done on, you have to have one book per roll. You can't put multiple books on the same roll. It has to be on a single.
You can see, this is a matter of logic, really, that
yes.
But then, there's this whole contradictory dialectic in Christianity between wanting to embrace Judaism and reject it.
Sure.
That this would work itself out in Christian worship. Was there a preference for role reading in Christian worship?
That's a great question. We don't know. But that's precisely the sort of question that hasn't really been highlighted. So, did insofar as the scripture of the first Christians was Jewish scripture, did they read aloud from rolls in the same manner as the rabbis tell us?
We don't know.
And we don't know. Yeah. The answer is that we don't know. Wow.
Do you think they read out loud? Do you think they read out loud at all?
Yeah.
But the liturgical context in general, I mentioned the monastery of Shenouda in late antiquity as an example of how Christians don't really reject the role, they just see it as having its own authoritative angle. So Shenouda, when he wrote, he lived alone in the desert and wrote these brutal attacks on his monastic community, telling them how sinful they were, etc. And he'd write them on a papyrus letter roll, and it would get sent to, so far as I can deconstruct, it would get sent to the community. Somebody would read it aloud if he wasn't there in person. Everybody there's a ritual of collective repentance, but it was only, actually, I think it was only when Shenouda, standardized, he said, we're going to read my writings at these 4 yearly meetings, and you formalize the ritual. We're going to read them, and you're all going to cry and repent, and then we're going to get closer to God. It was only when he liturgicized them that he ordered them to be transferred from papyrus roll to Codex. And presumably that's because, most Christians by that time used the Codex in liturgy, so if there's going to be a liturgy of collective repentance, his writings need to be in the Codex and need to be canonized in some way. But that's not to say that the papyrus roll didn't have its own authority. I mean, he was writing with a papyrus roll originally just like they imagined the prophets. So he was like a monastic prophet in the earlier. Okay, well, it's past time, so thank you again.